The smell of dust and whiskey hung thick in the afternoon air when Yates Crawford first noticed the woman with the bruised face walking past the livery stable, her head down, and her hand clutching a basket of linens so tight her knuckles had gone white. It was September of 1878 in Pecos, Texas, where the sun beat down mercilessly and secrets festered in the dry heat like open wounds. Yates had been shoeing a mare when something about the way she moved, careful and pained, made him set down his tools and wipe the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He had seen her before, of course. Pecos was not big enough for strangers to go unnoticed. Her name was Hannah Emerson, and she worked at the boarding house on the east end of town, changing sheets and serving meals to the men who passed through looking for work or trouble or both. She kept to herself mostly, never causing problems, never drawing attention. But today, in the harsh glare of sunlight, there was no hiding the purple bruise that bloomed around her left eye like some terrible flower, or the cut on her lower lip that had scabbed over dark and angry. Yates felt something tighten in his chest. He was not a man given to impulsive action, having learned through 26 years of hard living that patience served better than rage. But watching her try to disappear into the afternoon, shadows made his jaw clench. He crossed the dirt road in long strides, his boots kicking up small clouds of Texas dust. "Miss Emerson," he called out, keeping his voice low and steady so as not to startle her. She stopped but did not turn around immediately. When she did, her one good eye was wide with something like fear, though she tried to mask it with a wan smile that did not reach anywhere near her eyes. "Mr. Crawford," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did not see you there." He stood a respectful distance away, aware that he was a tall man, broad-shouldered from years of ranch work and blacksmithing, and that his presence might intimidate rather than comfort. "I did not mean to bother you," he said carefully, "but I could not help but notice." He gestured vaguely toward his own face, letting the implication hang in the air between them. Hannah's free hand moved instinctively to her bruised eye, then fell away just as quickly. "I took a fall," she said, the lie coming out practiced and hollow. The stairs at the boarding house are poorly lit. Yates had grown up around liars and cheats, had played poker with men who could spin tales as easily as breathing. He knew deception when he heard it. More than that, he knew the particular quality of shame that came from covering for someone else's violence. His own mother had worn that same expression too many times before consumption finally took her when he was 15. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice dropping even lower. Edged with something dangerous, her eyes went wide again and she took a half-step backward. "I told you I fell. It is nothing. Please, Mr. Crawford, I need to get these linens delivered." He wanted to press, wanted to demand answers, but he could see the panic rising in her face. So instead, he simply nodded once. "All right," he said. "But if you ever need help, Miss Emerson, any kind of help at all, you come find me. Do you understand?" She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether his offer was genuine or some kind of trap. Finally, she gave a small nod and hurried away, her skirts swishing against the dusty ground. Yates watched her go, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He did not know who had put that bruise on her face, but he intended to find out. Over the next 2 weeks, Yates made it his business to keep an eye on Hannah Emerson without being obvious about it. He learned that she lived in a small room behind the boarding house, that she rose before dawn to start the breakfast fires, and that she rarely spoke to anyone beyond what was necessary for her work. He also learned that there was a man who came around sometimes, usually late in the evening when the respectable folks had gone to bed. The man's name was Dalton Reid, and he worked as a foreman at one of the larger ranches outside town. He was known for having a mean streak and a fondness for whiskey that did not improve his temperament. Yates did not like jumping to conclusions, but the pieces fit together in a way that made his blood run cold. Still, he had no proof, and Hannah had not come to him for help as he had offered. He found himself thinking about her at odd moments while he worked, wondering what had brought her to Pico's, what kept her trapped in whatever situation had put that bruise on her face. The answer came on a Saturday night in early October, when the temperature had finally started to drop from the unbearable heat of summer into something more tolerable. Yates had been at the saloon, nursing a single beer and playing a half-hearted game of cards, when he heard the shouting from outside. It was not unusual to hear raised voices in Pico's, especially on a Saturday when the ranch hands came into town with money in their pockets and nothing to spend it on but whiskey and women. But something about the pitch of fear in the woman's voice made him throw down his cards and push through the saloon doors without a word to the other players. The scene in the street made his vision narrow to a pinpoint. Dalton Reed had Hannah by the arm, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough that Yates could see her wince even from 20 feet away. Reed was shouting something about disrespect and disobedience, his words slurring together in a way that suggested he had been drinking for hours. Hannah was trying to pull away, her face a mask of terror and resignation all at once. "Let her go," Yates said, his voice carrying across the space between them with a clarity that cut through Reed's drunken ranting. Reed turned, his bloodshot eyes trying to focus on this new threat. "This is none of your concern, Crawford. The woman belongs to me." "No one belongs to anyone," Yates said, taking several steps closer. "Now let her go before this gets ugly." Reed laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound. "You think you can tell me what to do? You think you can just walk up and take what is mine? She is not yours," Yates said, his voice dropping to something cold and hard as iron. "And if you do not take your hands off her right now, I am going to make you regret ever laying a finger on her." For a moment, everything hung in balance. Then Reed made his choice. He shoved Hannah away hard enough that she stumbled and fell to the ground, and then he came at Yates with his fists raised and murder in his eyes. The fight was brutal but short. Reed was bigger than Yates by a good 20 pounds, but he was drunk and sloppy, telegraphing every punch before he threw it. Yates ducked under the first wild swing and buried his fist in Reed's gut, doubling him over. The second punch caught Reed on the jaw with a crack that echoed off the false fronts of the buildings lining the street. Reed went down hard, blood streaming from his split lip. Yates stood over him, breathing hard, his knuckles already starting to swell. "If I ever see you near Miss Emerson again," he said, his voice low and deadly serious, "I will not stop at just putting you on the ground. Do you understand me?" Reed spat blood into the dirt but did not answer. After a moment, he pushed himself up and staggered away into the darkness, casting one last venomous look over his shoulder. Yates turned to where Hannah still sat in the street, her dress covered in dust, her eyes wide with shock. He approached slowly, crouching down beside her and offering his hand. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head mutely, but when she took his hand, hers was trembling. He helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed slightly. A small crowd had gathered outside the saloon, watching with the kind of avid curiosity that came from living in a place where entertainment was scarce. Yates shot them a look that sent most of them shuffling back inside. "Let me walk you home," he said quietly to Hannah. She nodded, and they set off down the street together, moving slowly through the pools of lamplight that spilled from windows and doorways. They did not speak for several minutes, the silence between them heavy with things unsaid. Finally, when they were far enough from the saloon that the noise had faded to a distant murmur, Hannah stopped walking. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "You could have been hurt. He could have had a gun." "I could not just stand by and watch," Yates said simply. "No man has the right to treat a woman that way, no matter what he thinks he is owed." Hannah looked down at her hands, twisted together in front of her. In the dim light, Yates could see fresh tears tracking down her cheeks. "You asked me before who did it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who gave me the black eye?" "You do not have to tell me anything you do not want to," Yates said gently, "but I am listening if you want to talk." She drew in a shaky breath, and then the words started coming, slow at first and then faster, like water breaking through a dam. "His name is Dalton Reid, as you now know. We were married 3 years ago back in Missouri. I thought he was a good man. He seemed kind when he was courting me, said all the right things. My father had died the year before and my mother was sick, and I was desperate for someone to take care of us. So when Dalton asked, I said yes." She paused, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. Yates wanted to reach out and comfort her, but he held himself still, letting her tell the story in her own time. "It started small," she continued. "Little criticisms. The way I cooked was not right. The way I kept the house was not good enough. Then he started drinking more, and the criticisms turned into shouting. And then one night, he hit me for the first time because his supper was cold. He apologized afterward, cried, and said he would never do it again. I believed him because I wanted to, because I had nowhere else to go. My mother had died by then, and I had no money, no family." "Hannah," Yates said, his heart breaking for her. "It got worse," she said, her voice stronger now, as if the act of telling was giving her strength. "Much worse. He would beat me for anything, for nothing. Just because he was angry at the world and I was there. 2 years of that, Mr. Crawford. 2 years of walking on eggshells and trying to be invisible. And then one day, he told me we were moving to Texas because he had a job opportunity. I thought maybe things would be different in a new place. But they were not. They were exactly the same." "Why did you not leave him?" Yates asked, then immediately regretted the question when he saw her flinch, but she did not seem angry, only tired. "Where would I go? I have no money. Everything I earn at the boarding house he takes. Says he is entitled to it as my husband. And even if I could save enough to run, where would I run to? The law would not help me. A wife is her husband's property in the eyes of the law. If I left, he could drag me back, and no one would say a word against it." The bitter truth of her words settled over them like a shroud. Yates knew she was right. He had seen it happen before, women trapped in marriages that were prisons, with no legal recourse and no social support. The injustice of it made him want to hit something, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You are not his property," he said firmly. "I do not care what the law says. You are a human being and you deserve to be treated with respect and kindness." Hannah looked up at him then, really looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. "Why do you care?" she asked, and there was genuine confusion in her voice, as if the concept of someone caring about her welfare was foreign. Yates considered the question carefully. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said. "And because I have seen what it does to people when they are beaten down day after day, when they start to believe they deserve it. My mother lived that way. I was too young to help her, but I am not too young now, and I am not going to stand by and let it happen to someone else if I can prevent it." They started walking again, and when they reached the boarding house, Hannah turned to face him. "What happens now?" she asked. "Dalton will be furious. He will come back." "Then we will deal with that when it happens," Yates said. "But you are not going back to him, do you hear me? I do not care if he is your husband in the eyes of the law. You are not going back to a man who beats you." "I do not have anywhere else to go," she said helplessly. Yates thought quickly. Mrs. Patterson, the woman who runs the general store, she has a spare room above the shop. She is a good woman, a widow. I will talk to her tomorrow, see if she would be willing to let you stay there for a while. You can keep working at the boarding house if you need the money, but you will have a safe place to sleep at night. Hannah stared at him as if he had just offered her the moon. You would do that for me. You barely know me. I know enough, he said quietly. I know you are brave and strong and that you deserve better than what you have been given. Let me help you, Hannah, please. She nodded slowly, and for the first time since he had seen her that afternoon weeks ago, she smiled. It was a small smile, fragile as spun glass, but it was real. The next morning, Yates went to see Mrs. Patterson as promised. The old woman listened to his carefully edited version of events with shrewd eyes that missed nothing, and when he finished, she nodded once. I always wondered about that girl, she said. She had the look of someone carrying a heavy burden. Yes, she can stay here. And if that good-for-nothing husband of hers comes around making trouble, you tell him he will have to answer to me. Yates smiled despite the gravity of the situation. Mrs. Patterson was barely 5 feet tall and had to be pushing 60, but she had a spine of steel and a shotgun she knew how to use. I will tell him, he promised. Getting Hannah moved without Dalton noticing proved easier than expected. The man had apparently taken Yates's warning to heart, at least for a few days, and made himself scarce. By the time he realized what was happening, Hannah was already installed in the room above the general store, and Mrs. Patterson had made it clear that any man who came sniffing around unwelcome would be met with buckshot. Over the following weeks, Yates found himself spending more and more time at the general store, ostensibly to buy supplies but really just to check on Hannah. They would talk, tentatively at first and then with growing ease. He learned that she loved to read but had not had access to books in years. He brought her a battered copy of poetry by Walt Whitman that he had owned since he was 18, and her face lit up like Christmas morning. She learned that he had grown up on a hardscrabble ranch in New Mexico, that his father had died in a riding accident when Yates was 12, and that he had been taking care of himself and his ailing mother for years before she passed. She learned that he had a gift with horses, that he could gentle even the most skittish animal with patience and a soft voice. She learned that he was fundamentally kind, in a way that had nothing to do with what he could gain and everything to do with who he was at his core. As October bled into November, something shifted between them. The conversations grew longer, more personal. Hannah began to heal, not just physically but emotionally. The haunted look in her eyes faded, replaced by something brighter. She laughed more, a sound that Yates found himself wanting to hear as often as possible. For his part, Yates found himself falling for her in a way that took him completely by surprise. He had not been looking for love, had not even believed he had room for it in his carefully ordered life. But Hannah had slipped past his defenses without even trying. He loved the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the way she bit her lower lip when she was concentrating. He loved her strength, the way she refused to let what she had been through define her. He loved her gentleness, the way she could see beauty in small things like the sunset or a wildflower growing between the boardwalk planks. But he did not tell her any of this. She was still legally married, still technically bound to a man who had done nothing but hurt her. Yates would not add to her burdens by declaring feelings she might not want or be able to reciprocate. Then Dalton Reed came back into the picture. It was a cold evening in late November when the man showed up at the general store just as Mrs. Patterson was closing up for the night. Yates happened to be there, having stopped by to deliver some ironwork he had made for the store's new shelving. He heard the commotion from the back room and came out to find Reed standing in the doorway, swaying slightly, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. "Where is she?" Reed demanded, his eyes sweeping the room. "Where is my wife?" "She is not here," Mrs. Patterson said firmly, standing between Reed and the stairs that led to Hannah's room. "And even if she were, I would not let you near her." "You have no right," Reed spat. "She is my wife. She belongs to me." "She is a person, not a possession," Yates said, stepping forward so that he was shoulder to shoulder with Mrs. Patterson. "And you need to leave, now." Reed's eyes focused on Yates with difficulty, and his lip curled into a sneer. "You," he said. "You are the one who has been filling her head with ideas, turning her against her own husband." "I did not have to turn her against you," Yates said coldly. "You did that yourself every time you raised a hand to her." Reed took a step forward, and Yates tensed, ready for another fight. But before anything could happen, Hannah's voice came from the top of the stairs. "Dalton, stop." Everyone turned to look at her. She stood there in a simple gray dress, her hair pulled back, her face pale but determined. She descended the stairs slowly, each step measured and deliberate until she stood in the main room facing her husband. "Hannah," Reed said, and his voice was suddenly different, almost plaintive. "Hannah, please, come home. I am sorry. I will do better. I promise." "No," Hannah said, and though her voice shook slightly, the word was clear and firm. "No, Dalton, I am not coming back. I cannot keep living like that. I will not." "You do not have a choice," Reed said, anger creeping back into his tone. "You are my wife. The law says you have to come with me." "Then I will break the law," Hannah said, and there was steel in her voice that Yates had never heard before. "I will break the law and deal with the consequences, but I will not go back to you." Reed stared at her, incomprehension written across his face. "You cannot mean that. What will you do?" "How will you survive?" "I will figure it out," Hannah said. "I have been surviving despite you for years. I think I can manage without you just fine." For a long moment no one moved. Then Reed seemed to crumple, all the fight going out of him at once. "Fine," he said, his voice bitter. "Fine. Have it your way. But do not come crawling back to me when you realize what you have thrown away." He turned and stumbled out into the night, leaving the door swinging open behind him. The cold November air rushed in, and Yates hurried to close it. When he turned back, Hannah was trembling violently, her arms wrapped around herself. Mrs. Patterson moved to her side immediately, but it was Yates that Hannah looked at, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I did it," she whispered. "I actually did it." "You did," Yates said, crossing to her and taking her hands in his. "You were so brave, Hannah. I am so proud of you." She laughed, a sound halfway between joy and hysteria, and then she was crying, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. Yates pulled her into his arms without thinking, holding her while she cried out years of pain and fear and frustration. Mrs. Patterson tactfully retreated upstairs, leaving them alone in the dim light of the general store. When Hannah finally quieted, she pulled back slightly to look up at Yates. "What happens now?" she asked, echoing the same question she had asked weeks ago. "Now," Yates said gently, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her face, "now you get to decide what you want, no one else, just you." "What if what I want is impossible?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Tell me anyway," he said. She took a shaky breath. "I want to be free of him, really free, not just living apart. I want to not have to look over my shoulder every day wondering when he will come back. I want to feel safe." "You will," Yates promised. "I will talk to the sheriff tomorrow, see what can be done. There are some territorial judges who will grant divorces in cases of abuse, especially if the woman has witnesses willing to testify. It might take time and it might not be easy, but we will find a way." "We?" Hannah asked, something hopeful flickering in her eyes. Yates realized what he had said and felt heat creep up his neck. "I mean, if you want my help, I do not want to presume." "I want your help," Hannah said quickly. "I want more than that if I am being honest. But I do not know if I have the right to ask for it. I am still married, at least on paper, and I come with so much trouble." "You are worth any amount of trouble," Yates said, the words coming out more intense than he had intended. "Hannah, I know this is not the time or the place, and I know you have been through hell. But I need you to know that I have come to care for you. A great deal. And if you will let me, I would like to be there for you. Not just now, but for whatever comes next." Hannah stared at him, tears streaming down her face again, but these were different tears. "You care for me?" she asked, as if she could not quite believe it. "More than I have words for," Yates admitted. "You are the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I have ever met. And I would count myself lucky beyond measure if you would let me stand beside you." She reached up and cupped his face in her hands, her touch gentle and wondering. "I care for you too," she whispered. "I have for weeks now, but I was afraid to say anything. Afraid that I was just latching onto the first person to show me kindness. But it is more than that. You make me feel safe. You make me feel like maybe I am worth something after all." "You are worth everything," Yates said fiercely. And then he was kissing her, soft and careful and full of all the things he did not have words to express. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Hannah felt something like hope blooming in her chest. The next several months were difficult, but also filled with small moments of joy. True to his word, Yates spoke to the sheriff, who directed them to a territorial judge known for being sympathetic to women in Hannah's situation. The process of getting a divorce was complicated and required testimony from multiple witnesses. Mrs. Patterson spoke on Hannah's behalf, as did several of the women from the boarding house who had seen her bruises over the years but had been too afraid to speak up before. Even the doctor who had treated Hannah for a broken rib the previous winter came forward with his records. Through it all, Yates was there. He accompanied Hannah to meetings with lawyers, held her hand during difficult conversations, and reminded her on the dark days that she was doing the right thing, that she deserved happiness and freedom. Dalton Reed did not go quietly. He contested the divorce, hired a lawyer of his own, and tried to paint Hannah as an unfaithful wife who had abandoned her marriage vows. But the evidence against him was overwhelming, and in the end, even his lawyer could not refute the testimony of so many witnesses or the medical records documenting years of abuse. In March of 1879, the judge granted the divorce, declaring the marriage null and void. Hannah walked out of the courthouse a free woman for the first time in 4 years. Yates was waiting for her on the steps, and when she saw him, she ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck and laughing with pure joy. "It is over," she said. "It is really over." "It is," Yates agreed, spinning her around once before setting her back on her feet. "So what do you want to do now?" Hannah looked up at him, her eyes shining. "I want to live," she said simply. "Really live. I want to do all the things I could not do before. I want to read books and take walks in the evening and not be afraid. And I want to do those things with you if you will have me." "Always," Yates said, and kissed her right there on the courthouse steps, not caring who saw them. They were married quietly in April with Mrs. Patterson and a few close friends in attendance. It was nothing like Hannah's first wedding, which had been a big affair with fancy dresses and distant relatives pretending to care. This wedding was small and simple and perfect. Hannah wore a blue dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her make, and Yates wore his best suit, freshly pressed. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Yates looked at Hannah like she was the most precious thing in the world, and she looked back at him with absolute trust and love. They moved into a small house on the outskirts of Pecos, nothing grand but clean and comfortable, with a little plot of land where Hannah planted a garden. Yates continued his work as a blacksmith and occasional horse trainer, and Hannah took on sewing work that she could do from home. Money was not plentiful, but they did not need much. They had each other, and that was enough. The first months of their marriage were a revelation for Hannah. She had to learn that not all men were like Dalton, that Yates's kindness was not a facade that would crack under pressure. There were times when she flinched at sudden movements, times when a raised voice would send her heart racing with old fear. But Yates was patient with her, giving her space when she needed it and reassurance when she asked for it. Slowly, carefully, she began to trust that this new life was real and permanent. For Yates, watching Hannah blossom was its own reward. He saw her confidence grow day by day, saw the way she began to take up space without apologizing for her existence. She laughed more, sang while she worked, and began to dream about the future instead of just surviving the present. They would sit on their porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the Texas plains, and talk about everything and nothing. He told her stories about his childhood, and she shared memories that she had kept locked away for years. They learned each other in the way that people do when they have time and safety and love. By summer, Hannah announced that she was pregnant. Yates was overjoyed, immediately fussing over her and trying to keep her from doing any heavy work. Hannah laughed at his concern but secretly loved it, loved that he cared enough to worry. They spent the long, hot months preparing for the baby, fixing up a corner of their bedroom to serve as a nursery and accumulating blankets and tiny clothes from the women in town, who were thrilled to see Hannah so happy. Their son was born in February of 1880, during a cold snap that had everyone in Pecos huddled close to their fires. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Yates thought he might lose his mind with worry. But Hannah was strong, stronger than even she had realized, and when the baby finally came, she held him with fierce pride and wonder. They named him Thomas, after Yates's father. He was a healthy baby with a good set of lungs and his mother's eyes. Yates held his son for the first time and felt something shift inside him, a sense of purpose and responsibility that went beyond anything he had known before. This was his family, these two people who depended on him and loved him. He would do anything to protect them and keep them safe. The years that followed were not without challenges. Money was sometimes tight, especially during droughts when the ranchers had less work to give. There were illnesses and injuries, the normal wear and tear of frontier life. Once, Dalton Reed came back to Pecos, drunk and belligerent, demanding to see Hannah. Yates had to physically throw him off their property while Hannah kept Thomas inside. The sheriff got involved that time, and Reed was told in no uncertain terms that if he came back, he would be arrested. They never saw him again. Years later, they heard through the grapevine that he had been killed in a bar fight in El Paso. Hannah felt a complicated mix of relief and sadness at the news, but mostly relief. But for every challenge, there were 100 small joys. Thomas grew into a bright, curious child who loved horses almost as much as his father did. When he was 3, Hannah became pregnant again, and this time the labor was easier. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1883, and they named her Margaret, after Hannah's mother. She was a calm baby where Thomas had been fussy, content to observe the world with solemn eyes. As the children grew, so did the family's prosperity. Yates had a reputation as the best blacksmith and horse trainer in the region, and people came from miles around to hire him. Hannah took in more sewing work and eventually started teaching reading lessons to some of the children in town whose parents could not afford formal schooling. They were able to expand their house, adding a proper bedroom for the children and a workshop for Yates. Through it all, their love for each other only deepened. They had built something real together, a life based on mutual respect and genuine affection. They still sat on their porch in the evenings, now with children playing in the yard and years of shared history between them. Yates would sometimes look at his wife and marvel at how far they had both come, from that terrible day when he had first seen her with a black eye to this life of peace and contentment. Hannah felt the same wonder. There were still nights when she had bad dreams, when the memories of her first marriage crept in like poison. But then she would wake up in the darkness and feel Yates's arm around her, steady and safe, and she would remember that those days were behind her. She was free. She was loved. She was home. In 1885, when Thomas was 5 and Margaret was 2, the family took a trip to San Antonio to visit some of Yates's distant relatives. It was Hannah's first time leaving Pecos since she had arrived 7 years earlier, and she was nervous about the journey. But Yates was patient with her anxiety, and the children were excited enough for all of them. They traveled by wagon, camping under the stars at night and taking their time on the dusty roads. San Antonio was bigger and busier than anything Hannah had ever seen, and she found it both exhilarating and overwhelming. But with Yates beside her and the children to care for, she felt anchored. They spent a week there, seeing the sights and meeting family, and by the time they headed back to Pecos, Hannah realized that she had changed. She was not the frightened woman who had needed to hide in a room above a general store. She was strong and capable, a mother and a wife and a person in her own right. The trip marked a turning point. After that, Hannah began to engage more with the wider world. She joined the church auxiliary and helped organize social events. She advocated for better conditions for women in town who found themselves in situations similar to what she had endured. She spoke openly about her experiences when asked, no longer ashamed of what she had survived. Her story gave hope to other women, showed them that escape was possible, that life after abuse could be good and full and worth living. Yates supported her in all of this, proud of the woman she had become. He watched her speak at a town meeting once, advocating for the establishment of a fund to help women leave dangerous marriages, and felt his heart swell with love and admiration. This was the woman he had married, fierce and compassionate and unwilling to stay silent in the face of injustice. By the time their 10th wedding anniversary rolled around in 1889, the Crawford family was well established in Pecos. Thomas was 9 years old and already helping his father in the workshop. Margaret was 6 and had inherited her mother's love of reading. Hannah was pregnant with their 3rd child, a surprise that had delighted them both even though they had thought their family was complete. On the evening of their anniversary, after the children had been put to bed, Yates and Hannah sat on their porch as they had done countless times before. The sky was clear and full of stars, and the air was warm with the promise of summer. "You remember the first time we sat out here?" Yates asked, his arm around Hannah's shoulders. "Of course," Hannah said, leaning into his warmth. "I was so nervous. I kept thinking that something would go wrong, that this happiness could not possibly last." "And now?" Yates asked. Hannah smiled, resting her hand on her growing belly. "Now I know better. This is real. This is our life, and I would not trade it for anything in the world." Yates pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I love you," he said simply. "I have loved you since that day you stood up to Dalton, so brave and scared and determined. I will love you until the day I die." "I love you too," Hannah said, tilting her face up to kiss him properly. "You saved me, Yates. You gave me a life I never thought I could have. You saved yourself. Yates corrected gently. I just gave you a safe place to land. Everything else, all the healing and growing and becoming the woman you are now, that was all you. Hannah thought about that for a moment, then nodded. Maybe we saved each other, she suggested. You had your own wounds to heal, your own ghosts to lay to rest. Maybe we did that together. Maybe we did, Yates agreed, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. Their third child, another boy they named Daniel, was born that autumn. The birth was easier than either of the previous ones, and Hannah recovered quickly. Daniel was a happy baby who rarely cried and seemed content to be passed around from sibling to sibling. Thomas took his role as big brother seriously, always making sure the baby had his blanket or his toy. Margaret would sing to him, tuneless but enthusiastic songs that she made up on the spot. The years continued to pass, marked by the rhythms of family life and the changing seasons. There were harvests and droughts, celebrations and sorrows. Hannah's sewing business grew until she had more work than she could handle and had to turn away customers. Yates expanded his workshop and took on an apprentice, a young man who reminded him a bit of himself at that age, eager to learn and willing to work hard. Thomas grew into a fine young man, tall like his father and with a natural gift for working with animals. When he was 16, he started courting the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a sweet girl named Elizabeth who had Hannah's approval. Margaret showed an early talent for teaching and began helping her mother with the reading lessons. Daniel was rambunctious and wild, always getting into mischief but impossible to stay angry at for long. In 1895, Thomas married Elizabeth in a ceremony that brought the entire community together. Watching her eldest son exchange vows, Hannah found herself crying tears of joy. She thought about how different her life could have been, how close she had come to being trapped forever in darkness and pain. But instead, she was here, surrounded by family and friends, having built a life beyond her wildest dreams. Yates squeezed her hand, understanding without words what she was feeling. They had come so far together, survived so much, and they were still standing, still loving each other, still committed to the life they had built. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Crawford family continued to thrive. Thomas and Elizabeth had a daughter in 1896, making Hannah and Yates grandparents for the first time. Margaret eventually married a schoolteacher from a nearby town, and they settled close enough that Hannah could see her daughter regularly. Daniel, true to his wild nature, became a ranch hand and seemed to revel in the freedom of the open range. Through it all, Yates and Hannah remained the center of their family. They had grown old together, weathered by sun and time, but still fundamentally the same people who had fallen in love in Pecos all those years ago. They still sat on their porch in the evenings when weather permitted, still talked about everything and nothing, still held hands like newlyweds. One evening in the summer of 1900, as they celebrated their 21st wedding anniversary, Hannah looked at her husband in the fading light and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "Thank you," she said suddenly. Yates looked at her questioningly. "For what?" "For seeing me that day," Hannah said. "For asking who did it, for not letting me disappear into my pain, for giving me a reason to be brave." Yates pulled her close, his arms strong and sure around her. "You do not have to thank me for that," he said. "Loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life." "Still," Hannah insisted, "I need you to know what you mean to me, what all of this means to me." She gestured at the house behind them, the garden she had tended for over 20 years, the life they had built together. "I was so lost when you found me. I thought I would spend the rest of my life just surviving, just getting through each day. But you showed me that there could be more. You showed me what real love looks like." "We showed each other," Yates said, echoing her words from so many years ago. This life we have, we built it together. Every piece of it. Hannah nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of their grandchildren playing, Margaret's youngest visiting for the summer. The garden was in full bloom, vegetables and flowers she had planted with her own hands. Inside the house was a table she and Yates had built together, chairs they had refinished, curtains she had sewn. Every piece of their life bore the mark of their partnership, their shared history. "I am happy," she said, and realized as she spoke the words how profound they were. "After everything that happened, after all the darkness, I am genuinely, completely happy." "So am I," Yates said and kissed her temple. "So am I." They sat there as the sun set, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. The evening star appeared, bright and steady against the darkening blue. Somewhere a coyote howled, and the wind rustled through the cottonwood trees that Yates had planted when they first bought the property. Everything was as it should be, everything was exactly right. Years later, when people would ask Hannah about her life, she would tell them about the day a cowboy saw her walking with a black eye and asked who had done it. She would tell them how that simple question had been the beginning of everything, how it had led to freedom and healing and a love deeper than she had thought possible. She would tell them about Yates Crawford, the man who had given her not just safety but a real partnership, a real life. And she would tell them that sometimes, even in the darkest moments, there was hope. Sometimes, even when you thought you were broken beyond repair, someone would come along and show you that you were still whole, still worthy, still capable of joy. And for Yates, watching his wife tell their story, seeing the way she had transformed from that frightened woman with a bruised face into this strong, confident, beloved pillar of their community, he would feel that same sense of pride and wonder he had felt the first time she smiled at him. He had not set out to be anyone's hero. He had simply seen someone in pain and refused to look away. But in refusing to look away, he had found his purpose, his partner, his home. Together, they had built something beautiful out of the ashes of Hannah's old life. They had created a family, a legacy, a love that would endure long after they were gone. And when they were old and gray, sitting on that same porch and holding the same hands they had held for decades, they would look at each other and know with absolute certainty that they had lived well, loved well, and left the world better than they found it. The story of how Yates Crawford and Hannah Emerson found each other became the stuff of local legend in Pecos. Parents would tell it to their daughters as a reminder that they deserved respect and kindness. Young men would hear it and understand what it meant to truly love and protect without controlling. And Hannah herself became a beacon for women who needed help, always ready with a safe place to stay or a connection to resources that could help them escape dangerous situations. Their house, which had started as a small cottage, grew over the years to accommodate their expanding family. There were always grandchildren underfoot, always someone visiting, always laughter and life filling the rooms. And at the center of it all were Yates and Hannah, still deeply in love, still partners in every sense of the word, still proof that even the darkest beginnings could lead to the brightest endings.